Good afternoon, and welcome to the UCL Lunch Hour Lectures. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, good friend and colleague, Dr. Claire Thomson. Claire is a lecturer in Scandinavian film in the School of European Languages, Culture and Society in the Department of Scandinavian Studies. And she's going to talk to us today about short films in a small nation. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to have a chance to talk about what one of my students has described as the geekiest research project in history. You know, geekiness is always good, I think, when it comes to research. Just one little practical thing, I should warn you that if you are eating your lunch, please be sure to finish by about 22, because around that point I'm going to show a film clip which will probably put you off your lunch. Okay, so just be warned, especially if you're eating bacon sandwiches. Right away, I am going to highlight one of the words in this title. This research project, which dates from about 2 years ago, I've been working on it for about 2 years now, was originally called Short Films in a Small Nation, and it's now Short Films from a Small Nation. So this clearly is a shift of emphasis, and today's talk kind of focuses on that shift. When I started, I assumed that state-funded short films in Denmark would be very much about the Danish nation telling stories to itself about the Danish nation, people being instructed in how to be Danish, how to cycle correctly, that kind of thing. In fact, after the Second World War, and this is really my focus today, or our endpoint, if you like, there was a shift towards filmmaking in English and other languages, films which marketed, essentially, Danish culture abroad. And the image that you saw in the background there, Jakob was just asking about this, is actually a detail from a brochure which shows this shift. As you can see, that the title of the brochure is in English. This dates from 1948, a documentary in Denmark. And straight away, this is a bit problematic because I wouldn't say necessarily that the films I've been looking at are documentaries as such. But there's quite a weight there that rests on the idea of documentary, and as you can see, films of facts. What the Danes were trying to do at that point is they had been occupied by Nazi Germany during the Second World War, and at the end of the war, they had to come out of it looking as if they were on the right side of history. So these films that are being sent out into the world in the late 1940s are partly about staging Denmark as a modern democratic society, which it absolutely was, of course. You might just be able to see on the blue film strip that's forming the letter D that the little stick man has gone through trials and tribulations. There are airplanes, bombers at the top, which he's running away from, and he's running away from a Nazi swastika and sitting in jail and doing hard labor. And then he takes to sabotage from 42, 43. There was a very strong Danish resistance movement. A lot of the filmmakers I've been looking at were actually resistance men. So there's a very strong connection here between the occupation, the resistance, and the films that came afterwards. And then by the end, our happy little stick man is waving the Danish flag and running towards the sunshine. So this is what was hoped would happen in 1948. Now, it's interesting that while I've been doing this research and preparing this lecture in particular, there has been lots of discussion in Denmark about another kind of visual culture, another production called 1864. And if you're here because you have been fans of The Bridge and The Killing and Borgen and so on British television, I think you'll be looking forward to seeing 1864 when it arrives in the UK after Christmas. 1864 is a really sore point in the Danish imagination. It's a date when Denmark was defeated by Prussia and the other German armies and lost quite a bit of its territory on the German border. And this new television series dramatizes that event. And I don't know if your Danish is very fluent after having watched Borgen and The Killing and so on, but I'm sure that everybody, when they read the words DF storm, will be able to work out that this is a bit of a storm that has blown up. And DF is the Dansk Folkeparti, the right-wing populist or nationalist People's Party. They have been complaining lots about this series, that it's not historically accurate enough. And this is great because it's led to loads of debate in the press and around water coolers about two things in particular. First of all, who gets to decide what is accurate history anyway? And isn't history just another form of storytelling with its roots in facts, but it's still telling some kind of a story? And secondly, what should the relationship between the state and the films that it funds or part funds actually be? Since the mid-1990s, there's been a principle in Denmark which is called the arm's length principle, which means that any funding which the film industry or television gets from the state is given on the understanding that the state, the government, won't actually be involved in deciding the content, which seems reasonable enough, and the content is influenced by panels of consultants. And that's a principle which, under different names, actually goes back to the mid-1960s. Now, the period that I've been looking at runs up to about the mid-1960s. It runs roughly from the mid-30s to the mid-60s. So the filmmaking that I've been looking at doesn't actually fall under this arm's length principle. There's a much more direct, but also very complicated relationship between the Danish state and the films that it is funding in this period. Yes, I thought I was being really smart putting in loads of animations and then forgot about them. So what are these films that I've been looking at? Well, they are on a wide variety of subjects. There are somewhere between 400 and 1,000 short films, depending on how you define them and where you stop counting. I have not seen even a tiny fraction of those. But they are on all kinds of subjects, from the correct cultivation of potatoes, to anti-speeding, to the city of Copenhagen, to different kinds of animals, to provision for pensioners, and so on. And so the question is, what sense can I actually make out of such a wide variety of films? Or, what were these films actually for? Well, they were officially for education, enlightenment, and general propaganda. That was the remit as set up in the mid-1930s. And of course, we're all very suspicious of that word propaganda, but we don't need to take it as anything dubious or suspect. It just means promotion in this particular context. And the films were commissioned and funded by different government ministries and charities and sometimes companies, really a wide variety of different funders and commissioners. What do we call them is also quite an interesting problem for me. The Danes call them Kulturfilm, as do the Germans, culture films. That's fine, but it doesn't really work in English. The Danes have another fantastic word, which is oplysningsfilm, enlightenment films, but I can't say that in English because it just sounds a bit 18th century. Some scholars have started to use the term useful cinema, which I use sometimes, and at the moment I'm stuck with informational film, which is really not very inspiring, but it tells you what these films do. Somewhere between documentary and public information films. Where were they shown? I'm always asked this at parties. Well, they were shown in schools, of course, libraries. Libraries tended to have projection equipment stations so that people could go borrow a film and then watch them. In different clubs. The Danes love their clubs. Every Dane belongs to about 10 different clubs, be it badminton clubs or political clubs. And trade fairs abroad, film festivals, definitely. And cinemas, and they were called forfilm, the film that comes before the main feature. These kinds of questions also let me answer the question that you're probably dying to ask, which is why on earth would you research this kind of cinema? There are many reasons for that, but three main ones are, firstly, that these films are artistic expressions of political priorities. By looking at these films, we can tell quite a lot about what the political priorities and anxieties of the day actually were. Secondly, they tell us quite a lot about Danish cultural history, everything from farming practices to fashion. And also because they had a really, really wide audience reach. Now, this kind of cinema tends to get forgotten about. We research feature films, fiction films, and we tend to forget about all the other short films that were made by companies and charities and educational institutions. But these films would have been seen by, in some cases, as you'll see later on, millions of people. So they were very influential. Now, I am looking at a triumvirate of institutions. And the first one is Dansk Kulturfilm, so Danish culture film, first set up in 1932. And they had started to make films by the end of the 1930s, but very, very slowly, and not particularly professionally. And I've included here the signatures of the founding director and the director who took over from him, really to emphasize that this is a story about people. Institution sounds very dry, but when you're sitting looking through the letters that they've written to each other and the gossip that circulated about each of them, this is a small nation. Everybody knows everybody else. So the way that these institutions run is very much through personal relationships, and it's important not to lose sight of that. So Dansk Kulturfilm was an agency. They didn't actually produce films, but they brought people who wanted films made together with the film producers. If you make films, you also have to find a way to distribute them. And so another institution called Statens Filmcentral, the State Film Centre, was also set up in the late 30s to make sure that schools and libraries and clubs actually did have access not only to films, which they could hire, but also to the equipment that they needed in order to project them in church halls and cafes and people's living rooms and wherever. And again, prominent figure Ebbe Nergård, who was the director of Statens Filmcentral. At this point, I'm also going to put in the signatures of 3 of the important directors. And here's where I get a little bit controversial, because most of the people who are looking at useful cinema insist that the actual film directors themselves are not important. What's important is the film as a product, and it's not an artistic product. Now, in the Danish context, some of these films are actually things of great beauty. And I will not listen to anybody saying that they're not artworks and deserve to be analysed as such in their own right. So, as with most signatures, these are pretty illegible, but the one in the middle is Carl Dreyer, who I'm sure most of you have heard of, one of Denmark's great auteurs. He was involved in the making of about a dozen of these short informational films, really to make money in the 1940s. But his name, his fame abroad, was also exploited very much to give the films greater circulation. Then we've got a very illegible and splodgy signature. This is Theodor Christensen. I'll be showing you a couple of clips from his films. And I would describe him as a short or documentary auteur, an absolutely wonderful and underrated filmmaker who's celebrating his centenary this year, but has been largely forgotten, even in Denmark. And then another example would be Ingolf Boysen, and we'll also see an extract from one of his films later on. He's interesting because he was one of these nodes in the cultural network of Denmark, one of these people who just knows everybody and makes things happen and is extremely interested in technology, travelled all over the world making films. A very interesting man. Yeah, so this is kind of the material I'm working with, and most of the time it's not me sitting in a room very glamorously watching films. Most of the time it's going through very old tea-stained documents, trying to work out who paid for what and what controversies arose along the way. Now, what I'm going to do now is go through a few concrete examples, because none of this really makes sense unless you actually look at the films themselves. And we're starting with one of these kind of old tea-stained documents. These are just a typical kind of document that I've been going through. And they show well, on the left we've got the top, the most hired, so the most requested films in Statens Filmcentral's list in 1952 to 3. And on the right-hand side, we've got a list of the same films in stock in 59 to 60 and the number of times that they were borrowed. And I kept seeing this film title, How a Brick is Made, for Lils in Moorsten Virtil. It appears in this top 50 films all the way through until 1960. So I thought, this must be an absolutely fantastic film. You know, How a Brick is Made. Hundreds of people every year hired this film, and then, you know, 50 people at a time might have watched it. So I was very, very excited. I paid quite a lot of money to get this film digitized. And if I now show you this film and just let it play in the background behind me, and I can do that because there's no sound, it's still using intertitles in 1940, you'll see that it's very difficult to understand why it was quite so popular for such a long time. It's just describing the different stages in the process of making bricks. And yeah, we've got people working there, but there's no personal interest here. There's a lot of interest in the machines. But this is just a very workaday, run-of-the-mill film. There's nothing really artistic about this at all. And yet, it stayed in function, and it was seen by lots and lots of people for about 20 years. So this tells us two things. One, there's no accounting for tastes, and we have to remember that these films were used and circulated in ways that are quite unexpected. Secondly, that there's very little that I can tell about how ordinary people actually reacted to these films, how they received them, how they understood them. I can't interview people who saw this film in the 1940s. Well, I suppose I could, but it would be quite difficult to track them down. So there are lots of gaps in the story. This next example is by Theodor Christensen. He's the one that I just described as something of a documentary auteur. And this is from 1942, so it's a couple of years into the German occupation of Denmark. And I'll play it and then explain the context, and I think you'll see that this is somewhat different.
Jernet skal hugges i passende småstumper, før det smeltes om. Metal er råstof. Råstof betyder arbejde. Bly.
Akkumulatorer, tingsoldater, vindkapsler,
Kobber.
kobbertråd, kobbertråd,
Tin.
sølvpapir, tingkrus,
Messing.
hængelamper, væggeure,
Aluminium.
mælkekapsler.
Alt det betyder arbejde.
For 400.000 danske arbejdere i håndværk og industri.
So that you saw about a third of that film. It's 3 minutes long. It's very much, flashing the information up. And it was distributed in cinemas. So just imagine you're sitting there with your date. It's 1942 on a Saturday night, and you've got to get through the public information films before you can get to the romantic drama that comes next. If you have to get through those public information films, they have to be really good. They have to be funny. They have to make excellent use of music. They really have to distract your attention. This film was made as part of a recycling campaign, not for environmental reasons, as we would recycle today, but in order to keep Danish industry going during the occupation and to keep people in employment. And you see there how we segue from an interest in the individual workers over to this idea of 500,000 Danish workers in unison, and everything is very heroic. So he was extremely good, Theodor Christensen. Now, that quantum shift between the brick film and the recycling film is actually down to the establishment of another institution, and this is the third in my triumvirate, the Government Film Committee. And this was set up within the first year of the occupation to coordinate filmmaking to maximize employment, so for precisely this kind of film. But they were lucky enough to secure the services of Mogens Scott Hansen, who was both interested in film himself, but also an extremely good administrator. And under the auspices of the Government Film Committee, this kind of filmmaking went from strength to strength. And we can see Dansk Kulturfilm and the Government Film Committee as really sister organizations. The money from the government came through the committee, and Dansk Kulturfilm kept making the films. But this institutional history is really just for me to geek out over. It's not of any particular importance. This sea change during the Second World War, though, this attracted attention. And what you start to see immediately after the Second World War is British newspapers actually taking notice of the Danish film movement. Denmark has a thriving film movement to date. This is the Scottish film pioneer Forsyth Hardy. And he describes how he has visited Denmark and seen this amazing change, and describes the history behind it, and praises the Danish filmmakers to high heaven. There are countless articles like this. The reason why there was this interest in Britain, in Danish filmmaking after the war, was that the Danes had realized, as early as 44 actually, that the end of the war was nigh, that Hitler was probably not going to win, and that they could use film immediately after the war as a means to market the country as a modern democratic land upon the liberation. So they started laying plans to do that. And one of the things they did immediately after the liberation in May 45 was to invite at least one British film figure, Arthur Elton, who used to work at the Ministry of Information just over there in the big University of London building. And he came over to help the Danes sharpen up their act and make films that would circulate well in the outside world. So we're back to this brochure again from 48. One of the things that it highlights is a collection of films which Arthur Elton helped the Danes make in 47. And the brochure announces it's back to normal, to freedom and contact between the peoples of the world. That is the watchword. And it's advertising a series of films under the title Social Denmark, giving a picture of care from the cradle to old age. This, of course, is one of the things that Denmark actually has to sell. The Social Denmark series is about people's holidays and holiday pay. It's about gardens and homes for pensioners. There's a film about health for Denmark, and this looks like an extremely dubious kind of treatment. I have no idea what's going on there. And Denmark grows up, about healthcare for children. You will notice that there's a slight preponderance of kind of healthy-looking, half-naked Danes in these films, which I think is probably not coincidental. The fifth film in the series was this one, Mødre Hjælpen, or Good Mothers, by Carl Dreyer. And it is extremely problematic in terms of its gender politics and its racial politics. If you want to, you can see it online. But it's an example of how Carl Dreyer, as a famous auteur in Britain, was co-opted into this series just to give it more visibility. So these films went down rather well at the Edinburgh Festival. They show a healthy attitude of discontent with the status quo, and they have a real validity for social students in all other countries. These were taken seriously. And there we just have a picture of our friend Arthur Elton. And this is taken from a newspaper article when he died in Denmark. He didn't die in Denmark, a newspaper article in Denmark after his death, which remembered him as a friend of the Danish film industry. Now, the success of these social films led to a little flurry of films, 48, 49, 50. And this is well timed as well, because this is an era when film festivals, especially documentary film festivals, are being set up all over the world. The United Nations has been established, and with it the United Nations Film Board, which also helped to distribute film and saw film as a very important tool for global education. So just to go through a few examples, this is a lovely film about pottery and other crafts in Denmark. And I'm flagging this one up partly because, as you can see, the title is in English. The original version of this was made in English, and it was like the Social Denmark films, made in English originally, not Danish, to appeal to an international audience. But shaped by Danish hands, circulated particularly widely, not only in the UK at a couple of cultural institutions, reaching 49,000 people in the UK, estimates the Danish embassy in its first year or two. But it also went on tour around South America in a Spanish version. And most astonishingly, it was distributed in the US and Canada by a company called Films of the Nations, reaching, they estimate, 2.4 million viewers. So this is a lot of people interested in Danish pottery, which is, I suppose, a sellable commodity. 49, the year after, is the year when the Edinburgh International Film Festival really takes off at this point. And I'm grateful to Mark David Jacobs at the Edinburgh Film Guild for sending me a scan of this guest book, because here we have Eben Neergaard and Theodor Christensen, two big names from Danish filmmaking. But we also have a team of younger filmmakers, 4 of them, who had, the story goes, crammed into a little yellow car and driven all the way from Copenhagen via London, all the way up the country to Edinburgh, just to be there for the film festival, to meet people, to have their names known. But the bottom one there, Nick Lichtenberg, he was extremely happy to be in Edinburgh in 1949 because he had almost lost his life twice the previous year, making one of the films that was screened in Edinburgh in 49. And that was a film called They Guide You Across, which I'm going to show you a clip of in just a moment. Nick was not the director, he was one of the cameramen who worked on They Guide You Across. And on one occasion, he was almost run over by an aeroplane. He was supposed to be shooting the takeoff of the aeroplane, was positioned at the end of the runway, and the pilot kind of missed the cue, ran over the camera, smashing it to smithereens, and narrowly missing poor Nick. And on another occasion, he was flying back from Prestwick to Copenhagen when there was a fuel leak, and he had to stand with a fire extinguisher and let it go off as soon as the plane touched down so that the whole thing didn't explode. So it's a dangerous business, making films. So here we have the programme of the Edinburgh International Film Festival 49, where They Guide You Across is mentioned. Directed by Ingolf Boysen. I think this is a good example to show, because it was one of the most ambitious films ever undertaken by Dansk Kulturfilm, both in terms of the technical aspects of it. They used a new kind of sound recording. They filmed the plane from the undercarriage and from another plane and so on. But it's still interested in the kind of detail that we saw with the brick film as well. How do things actually work? People love this. But most of all, what this film tries to do is position Denmark as a modern nation within the context of Scandinavia. You can probably see on the plane there, it is a Scandinavian airline system, or SAS plane, but within a globalizing world. And you will see in just a moment, I'll put the lights down again, how this film depicts the UK.
Very nice indeed. You're on the glide path. Your track is good. 3/4 of a mile from the runway. Turn right 3 degrees. Turn right 3 degrees. Half a mile. Half a mile from touchdown now. You're slightly above the glide path. 1/4 of a mile. 1/4 of a mile from the runway. You're on the glide path now. The runway is dead ahead of you. Look ahead and land. Over.
Well, Obo Fox Item, also known as Dan Viking, is in Scotland. It's nice to stretch your legs a bit.
Hello. SAS operations, please. SAS, approach control here. Your Obo Fox item was done at 1845, chops 48.
Okej. DFI har landat.
Det är fint, tack så mycket.
May I have your attention, please? Scandinavian Airlines Systems aircraft from Copenhagen has just landed.
Two good reports on that from the weather ship out here. This more westerly one is giving 45, and this one in here is reporting 40 knots now.
International cooperation means security. Aviators take, and by studying thoroughly reports from weather ships, liners and other aircraft, it is easy for them to choose the safest route over the ocean.
You go direct up to Keflavik.
Aviation demands care and precision. There are no weak links. Aircraft of improved construction are constantly being launched. Every technical development means even greater security in the air. But security can only be maintained by cooperation between the nations. Cooperation presupposes understanding. Understanding means peace.
So you can see there how at the very end of the film, the United Nations Film Board, which has come on board and sponsored the film in the form of raw film stock and in the form of distribution, insists on getting its message across that cooperation means peace and so on. If I may, I have one more clip, and this is the one that I warned you about. I hope you've finished your lunch now, because this film is a really successful example of how the needs of the various sponsors are actually incorporated into a film that is coherent and makes sense and is really a technological triumph. A simpler example, but a more hard-hitting example of how filmmakers really have to walk the thin line between making films that people will want to watch and pleasing their sponsors, comes with another film by Theodor Christensen called The Pattern of Cooperation, and I've worked a little bit with this on this film with my colleague Mary Hilson. There's a great example here of how the sponsors, which was the cooperative movement in Denmark, or at least they were working as consultants on the project, they really, really wanted the filmmakers to show in minute detail how vets checked pig carcasses for diseases and how they checked the quality. They really insisted on this. And so Theodor Christensen, our genius, had to find a way to make this kind of acceptable to viewers. I think he almost succeeded. And if I play this...
It is a bigger undertaking, but the principle of management is the same. Scrupulous cleanliness is observed. And again, the highest quality is demanded. Vets examine the carcasses. Uniform quality and appearance are essential. A good slaughterhouse sticks to the ideal of beauty in bacon.
Yes, so we can see how he segues there from showing what he must show in excruciating detail, but then straight over into the idea that pig carcasses, when they're hanging in a row, are actually very beautiful. And he makes this very artistic shot. Yes, so that's just a few examples of these really quite complicated production processes. If you want to read more about the pattern of cooperation, Mary and I have published an article which you can find at cosmorama.org. There are also more clips, less disgusting ones. And it's only left to say that the high point of dance culture film comes in 1960 with a city called Copenhagen, which was nominated for an Academy Award, an Oscar, in 1960 in the short film subject category. It didn't win, but it is an absolutely wonderful film. After that, as I said at the beginning, a new film ordinance comes in. New times, new technologies mean that the relationship between the state and filmmakers had to change in the 60s. So that's really the end of my project. I would just like to flash up some of these credits and thanks while you ask any questions that you would like to ask. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Claire. I remember seeing some of these movies, no, not the Bacon one, when I was back in school in the 70s in Denmark.
Yeah.
Didn't know I was being brainwashed with propaganda. We have time for questions, 5 or 6 minutes, and please wait for the microphones to come up, so put up your hands if you have any questions. Yes, we have a question down here, please. Just to give you some exercise.
Hello. Are these films shown at all in Denmark as historical documents?
No, not really at all anymore. And I did, when I was living in Denmark to do this project last year, I had a kind of unscientific means of determining that. I just asked everyone I met if they had seen any of these films. And a lot of them do remember 1 or 2 of them from school, but these days they're not used. To be used, they would have to be digitized, and slowly they are being digitized. You know, we're hoping that it will be possible to digitize more of them and make them available. But the problem is that because they're quite technical, they go out of date very quickly. So they're of historical interest rather than them actually being of use in education these days.
I have a question. You mentioned that there is a difference between the sort of pre-1960 ways of funding these films and then development since. But of course, we all know that there has been several waves of Danish cinema since that has also received sort of state funding. It might be a hallmark of this small nation that you put in the title. Can you tell us something about that relationship between the small nation and funding today in relationship to how it was at that time? They certainly wouldn't call it propaganda anymore. But
no, they would not call it propaganda anymore. But I think you're right to connect it to the idea of the small nation. And Mette Hjort has done a lot of work on the idea of Denmark as a small nation with quite a specific approach to funding its cinema. It's still the case today that the short film form receives state funding, and often it's used as a kind of training ground for filmmakers. It's the first film that they get to make before they take the step up to the feature film. But you're also right in saying that since the 60s there have been several adjustments to this policy, and that tends to go along with changes in the political landscape as well. There's a new film agreement just out last week, in fact, which we're all still trying to absorb and understand. The previous big change was in the 1990s, the late 1990s, round about the time of the dogma movement.
But is there the same interest in not only promoting what we could probably call Scandinavian or Danish values or the welfare state, as we saw in these early movies, to the same sort of interest in promoting Scandinavian culture through film today within the policies that are being made?
I don't think that comes out very explicitly. What is still explicit in the policies is the idea that Danish film should be of high quality, but it should also have a certain avant-garde air to it. So these are, they're not supporting blockbusters, they're supporting high quality film that pushes the art forward. And that was absolutely also the case in the era that I'm looking at. The filmmakers got, and I quote, free hands to interpret their briefs so that the films would be able to circulate internationally as impressive films.
Thank you very much. We have time for one more question. Mary, please.
The SAS example is interesting because that's an early example of successful Scandinavian cooperation. Was there any cooperation in filmmaking? Because they did work together to produce books and things.
Yes, there are various examples of that, informal and slightly more formal. For example, there were visits from the Swedish filmmakers to Danish filmmakers during the occupation, and lots of talk about collaboration. There's an interesting example which was Danish-led from the mid-60s, which is called Noget om Norden, something about Scandinavia, it was called in English. And that presents the 5 Nordic nations in the form of a cartoon. And it functioned quite flexibly in that it could introduce the Nordic nations to each other, but it could also function abroad to introduce the region as a whole. And then there were projects where each country was asked to make a film in a particular series. So yes.
Thank you. What would you recommend us to watch? What is the best of all these movies that you have seen, and when will we be able to see it over here?
Well, that's the thing. The best ones you can't actually see yet, and we're really hoping that they might be able to be digitized and made available. However, I think that the Dreyer films, which I flashed up about halfway through, if you just Google Carl Dreyer and DFI, you'll find the website. All of his short films are on there to watch. And also clips from his other films. And some of them are really little gems. I mean, Good Mothers, definitely not. Some of the other ones are really beautiful and bear his imprint.
So he was better at bridges than Mothers?
He was better at sculpture than Mothers.
Sculpture than Mothers. So. Right. That's a good recommendation. So off you go up to see some Dreyer shorts. Thank you again very much to Dr. Claire Thomson.